Okay, so you want to own a movie theater. Rows of seats, a giant screen, a line of people every Friday night handing over their money before the previews even start. It feels like one of the simplest transactions in retail. Someone wants to see a movie, there's only one place in town showing it on a 40-foot screen, so they walk in, they pay, they sit down. Simple supply, simple demand, simple profit. That is a story most people have in their head. It is also almost completely wrong. Here's the belief everyone walks in with. Movie theaters make their money selling movie tickets. It feels obvious. It's called a movie theater. People go there to watch movies. So the ticket must be the product, and the ticket price must be where the profit lives. It isn't. On a wide-release blockbuster's opening weekend, the theater can end up keeping almost nothing from the ticket price, sometimes handing over as much as 80 to 100% of that revenue straight back to the studio that made the film. Read that again. The theater can sell out every seat in the house on a Friday night for the biggest movie of the year and walk away with close to $0 from the tickets themselves. If you think a movie theater's business is selling movies, you've misunderstood the entire industry. A movie theater's business is renting your attention to a studio for 2 hours and then selling you popcorn while you're sitting there. So let's rewind to the actual beginning, before a single ticket is sold, before the marquee lights up. Someone has to decide to build the thing, and the movie theater, underneath all the glamour, is a real estate bet disguised as an entertainment business. You need a location with enough population and enough car traffic within a short drive to fill multiple auditoriums, multiple nights a week, for the next decade or more. You need a landlord willing to build out a space that is almost useless for any other type of tenant, because nobody else needs stadium seating, a sloped floor, and a projection booth. And you need a long lease, because the build-out cost is too large to justify walking away in 3 years. The number most people underestimate is the equipment. Modern digital projection systems run into the tens of thousands of dollars per screen, and a serious multiplex isn't one screen, it's 8. 12, sometimes 20. Add premium formats, IMAX, Dolby Cinema, oversized recliner seating with heating and reclining motors in every single seat, and the build-out cost for a modern multiplex can easily run into 8 figures before opening night. One detailed operator model for a mid-size multiplex put total capital expenditure at around $13 million, with a payback period stretching close to 2 years, even under a fairly optimistic forecast. And that's assuming nothing goes wrong with attendance in year 1. Then there's the sound. Auditoriums need acoustic isolation between screens, because nothing kills a date night faster than hearing explosions from the theater next door bleeding through the wall during a quiet drama scene. HVAC has to keep dozens of large, densely packed rooms comfortable simultaneously. And before any of that, you're paying architects, contractors, and permitting fees for a building type most cities don't approve quickly, because fire codes for a room built to hold hundreds of people in the dark with limited exits are exactly as strict as you'd expect. Here is the mechanism nobody explains at the box office window. When a studio releases a film, it isn't selling the movie to the theater outright, it's licensing it. And the split moves on a sliding scale that heavily favors the studio early and shifts toward the theater over time. In the first 1 to 2 weeks, the theater might keep only 20 to 50% of ticket revenue, sometimes far less on the biggest releases. By week 3 or 4, once the crowds have thinned out, that split can flip closer to 50-50 or even favor the theater, because by then, the studio has already captured the bulk of the opening rush that actually matters to them. This is why theaters obsess over new releases in their first 2 weekends and don't really care that much once a film has been out for a month. It's also why the exact same movie ticket, bought on opening night versus bought 4 weeks later, represents 2 completely different deals happening behind the counter, even though the customer paid roughly the same price for the seat. The theater is racing the clock. Every week a movie stays in theaters, more of the ticket revenue quietly shifts from the studio's column into the theaters. So if tickets barely pay the bills in the early weeks, where does the actual profit come from? A medium popcorn that cost a theater pennies to pop can sell for $8 or more, and unlike ticket revenue, virtually none of that has to be shared with anyone. Concession margins routinely run 85 to 90%, some of the highest margins in all of retail, food service included. At smaller independent theaters, concessions alone can account for as much as 80% of total revenue, with ticket sales almost functioning as the loss leader that gets people in the door in the first place. Larger chains lean more on ticket volume, but even there, food and beverage sales can approach 40% of total revenue, and it's disproportionately profitable revenue because the fixed cost of running the popcorn machine barely changes whether you sell 50 bags or 500. On top of concessions sits a whole second layer most audiences never think about. Pre-show advertising sold to brands, sponsorship deals, private theater rentals for corporate events and birthday parties, loyalty subscription programs that charge a flat monthly fee for a guaranteed number of movies, and premium format upcharges. A ticket in a standard auditorium and a ticket in an IMAX auditorium for the exact same film can differ by several dollars, and that premium format screen, despite being a small share of total screens nationally, can generate roughly double the revenue per auditorium of a standard screen showing the identical movie at the identical time. Now, the other side of the ledger, and this is where the fantasy runs into the wall. Rent doesn't fluctuate with how many people bought tickets on a Tuesday afternoon. Staffing, ushers, projectionists, concession workers has to be scheduled around showtimes regardless of how full the room ends up being. Film licensing costs eat directly into the one revenue stream, ticket sales, that theaters have the least control over since the studio sets the terms, not the exhibitor. Utilities for a building full of large, dark, climate-controlled rooms running for 12 or more hours a day add up fast. Insurance, maintenance on aging projection and sound equipment, and the eventual replacement of seating and screens all sit on the books whether the auditorium was packed or empty. The result is an industry where overall profit margins typically land somewhere between 10 and 20% blended across everything, a number that looks respectable until you realize how much of that is propped up entirely by concessions, subsidizing a ticket sales business that on its own in the crucial early weeks barely breaks even. The failure pattern in this industry is remarkably consistent, and it comes down to one brutal fact. The fixed costs of a movie theater do not care whether a single person walks through the door. Rent, staffing minimums, and equipment loans are due every month regardless of what's playing. So when attendance drops, even for reasons that have nothing to do with the theater itself, a weak release slate, a pandemic, a prolonged actors and writers strike halting production, the business doesn't gently lose a little profit. It goes straight into the red because there's no way to meaningfully shrink the cost of an empty building. That's exactly what happened at scale starting in 2020, when auditoriums sat completely empty while leases, loan payments, and insurance kept coming due regardless. It's also what pushed one of the world's largest theater chains into bankruptcy proceedings in 2022, and what's continued to claim high-profile operators since, including a well-known upscale dine-in chain that filed for bankruptcy protection as recently as this year. None of these companies failed because people stopped wanting to go to the movies entirely. They failed because the fixed cost structure of a theater gives it almost no room to breathe during any period of reduced output, whether that period lasts 2 months or 2 years. Look at the largest chain in the country as the cautionary tale of scale without margin. It has spent years fighting to keep its share price above water and its enormous debt load serviced, even while total box office numbers recovered to well over $9 billion domestically. The lesson isn't that bigger is automatically safer, it's that a chain carrying billions in real estate leases and debt needs consistently strong attendance just to stay level, and the industry hasn't fully returned to its pre-pandemic ticket volume even years later. Now look at the premium format story as the counterexample of a smart bet. Operators who invested heavily in giant screen formats saw those screens post a record year recently, up sharply from the year before and even beating their previous best year on record, commanding ticket prices roughly a third higher than the average and drawing studios to shoot entire films specifically for that format. That's the difference between a theater competing purely on convenience, which is a losing fight against a streaming subscription, and a theater competing on an experience that genuinely cannot be replicated on a couch at home. Scaling a movie theater chain is fundamentally a real estate expansion game layered on top of a content negotiation game. Every new location means negotiating a new lease, funding a new multi-million-dollar build-out, and hiring and training an entirely new staff, none of which gets meaningfully cheaper just because you've done it 100 times before, the way a software company's marginal customer costs approach zero. What does scale well is negotiating leverage with studios. A chain with thousands of screens nationally can negotiate more favorable terms and guarantee wider distribution for a film than a single independent theater ever could, which is exactly why the biggest chains have consolidated so much of the market even while individually carrying enormous debt loads. The theatrical release window, once roughly 90 days between a film's cinema debut and its home release, shrank to as little as 2 to 3 weeks during the pandemic, and the entire industry treated that shift as an existential threat to attendance. The trend has recently started reversing, with major studios extending that window back out toward 45 days, a signal that exhibitors' pressure campaign to protect exclusivity is working, at least for now. At the same time, theaters are leaning harder into what streaming genuinely cannot offer: giant screen formats, motion seating, private rentals, loyalty subscriptions that turn the occasional moviegoer into a predictable monthly payer, and dynamic pricing that charges more for a Saturday night blockbuster than a Tuesday matinee, extracting more value from the exact same seat depending on when it's occupied. So, is owning a movie theater actually worth it? The honest answer depends entirely on which theater you're picturing. A standard multiplex chasing ticket sales alone, competing purely on convenience and proximity, is fighting a business model with brutally thin margins in its most important revenue stream and razor-thin room for error the moment attendance dips. A theater that treats itself as a concessions and experience business that happens to project films with a lean cost structure, a smart mix of premium formats, and a loyalty program locking in repeat customers can be a genuinely durable, profitable business, just not for the reason most people assume when they walk in the door. So the next time you sit down in a dark auditorium and the trailers start rolling, understand what's actually happening in that room. You didn't just buy a movie ticket. You bought 2 hours of captive attention that the theater is renting from a studio at a price that barely covers the lights in exchange for the chance to sell you an $8 bag of popcorn that costs almost nothing to make. The screen is the bait. The concession stand is the business, and the theaters that understood that distinction early are the ones still standing.